Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello, you are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and this time I'm asking a simple question. Did Donald Trump's return to the White House really make US border controls tougher? Or have they always been strict, with some travelers from Czechia simply failing to understand the rules? Why did I decide to devote a whole episode to this subject? A Czechast listener wrote to me 2 weeks ago that earlier this summer, Czech clarinetist Jaroslav Škuta arrived in the United States planning to perform at public events. He was denied entry and deported. According to Janis Sidovský, a manager with long experience organizing concerts of Czech musicians across the United States, including at New York's famous Carnegie Hall, the explanation is very simple.
Prostě vy tam jedete pracovat a není rozhodující, jestli za to vezmete honorář, nebo jestli z lásky ke krajanům.
It's still a public performance, which counts as work, and for that you need a work permit in the form of a work visa. Thinking you're doing a good deed and will perform for free is unrealistic.
Není zcela na místě.
Jaroslav Škuta had ESTA, the electronic permission for tourists to enter the United States, but he was planning to work. And in the eyes of US immigration officers, that's all that matters. In this episode of Czechast, you'll hear that Jaroslav Škuta's story is not unique. Take Czech rock legend Petr Janda, who remembers being sent home from Miami.
Doprovázel mě do letadla, takový opravdu vysoký červený Američan.
A really tall black American accompanied me to the plane. He looked intimidating enough that I didn't even think of trying to run. They seated me on the plane, it was almost empty, and I flew back.
Letěl jsem zpátky, tam ani zadarmo to člověk nesmí.
That happened 7 years ago. And then there's the story of former Senator Martin Mejstřík recalling how US officers treated him at Los Angeles airport as a terrorist suspect, even though he held a diplomatic passport. And this was long before Donald Trump's first term in office.
Normálně po mně vystartovali s tím elektrickým obuchem.
They immediately charged at me, literally with a taser in hand. If it hadn't been for my assistant, who speaks fluent English and reacted quickly, they might have actually knocked me down with it.
Tu elektrikou k zemi.
Even Czech writer Patrik Banga wasn't spared when he landed at JFK Airport in New York last September, with Joe Biden still in the White House.
They took my phone, told me to sit down, and no one explained what was happening.
So, in Czech experience, are US border checks truly tougher now? Or are these just the same strict rules being enforced as they've always been? This episode of Czechast tells the real stories of several Czechs at the US borders in the past nearly 20 years.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
First, let me mention this. As I was working on a Czech program about the US border controls and the English version for Czechast that you are just listening to, relevant news came in. American non-governmental organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ, issued its first ever security advisory for journalists traveling to the United States. It warns that the risk of thorough inspections at the border is increasing, including searches of mobile phones, laptops and questioning focused on the content of journalists' work.
Reporting on politically sensitive topics including government policies or national security issues may draw scrutiny from authorities, assess potential risks before publication or broadcast,
states CPJ in its warning. It therefore advises journalists to back up or delete sensitive data from their devices, prepare legal assistant contacts and be ready for detailed personal and electronic inspections. As a cautionary example, CPJ cites the case of Australian journalist Alistair Kitchen, who was detained for 12 hours upon arrival at Los Angeles airport. Border officials searched his mobile phone and questioned him about his views on the war between Israel and Gaza, as well as his reporting on student protests at Columbia University. Ultimately, he was denied entry into the United States.
It's a clear case of retaliation in connection with his reporting. Such action sends a chilling message to journalists that they must support the administration's narratives or face forms of retribution. Foreign media operating on US soil are covered by First Amendment protections.
Says CPJ. I think it is important to add, even though CPJ doesn't mention it directly, that US authorities deny that Alistair Kitchen was refused entry due to his political views. His claims about the nature of his questioning are, according to them, clearly false.
The individual in question was denied entry because he gave false information on his electronic system for travel authorization application regarding drug use.
A spokesperson for the US Department of Homeland Security told Australian public broadcaster ABC. The article further explains that Kitchen admitted to using marijuana in New York, where it is legal. However, under federal law, it remains illegal. And I thought it important to mention this piece of news before going on, to share my own experience from US borders and the following stories.
May I have your attention, please? For security reasons, please keep your luggage with you at all times.
So, here I am, back in America after some time. I landed at John Fitzgerald Kennedy Airport in New York and successfully made it through immigration control. It was a long process, nearly 2 hours, but mostly because of the sheer volume of passengers, not because of any specific problem. In the end, everything went smoothly. I traveled to the United States on a journalist visa. It's valid for 5 years, and my previous one expired last year. Friends sometimes ask me why I don't make things simpler for myself and just travel on ESTA, the electronic authorization for tourists. It's more convenient, no need for an interview, and it's also significantly cheaper. But even if I'm coming just for a few days, I know that I'll be recording material to use in broadcasts for Czech radio, and that makes it a work trip. That is something I can't and won't get around. Maybe I could get away with it, but technically I would be lying to US federal authorities about the purpose of my visit, and that's serious. It's called felony, a criminal offense. So I take this very seriously and don't take any chances.
All individuals must maintain control of their personal...
In recent months, there's been a lot of talk and media coverage about strict border controls when entering the United States, especially the idea that Czechs have become tougher since Donald Trump returned to the White House. However, at the time I am recording this, there is no solid statistical evidence to confirm that. What is clear, however, is that US immigration controls became significantly stricter after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And getting through them has never been easy, even for those traveling on diplomatic passports, officially representing their countries. One person who experienced this firsthand was former Czech Senator Martin Mejstřík. In 2006, nearly 20 years ago, he traveled to the United States as part of an official delegation of Czech lawmakers and landed right here at JFK Airport in New York.
No a jeden ten sveřepej úředník mě vytáhl z té skupiny senátorský, takže mi jako co se děje a on jakože prohlídka.
Well, one of those rather aggressive officers pulled me out of the group of senators. We asked what was going on and he said there would be an inspection and an interview. Naturally, we tried to explain with the help of our escort who we were and why we were there. But the officer didn't respond. He simply dragged me into some office, which was quite unwelcoming. And the people sitting there didn't look much friendlier either. They started questioning me very harshly, who I was, where I was going, what I'd be doing in the United States. Standard questions, where I was staying, whether I had a job lined up. They tried various tricks on me. I must say it was extremely unpleasant.
Senátor, nesenátor, parlamenty České republiky, nic se nezajímalo. Navíc jsem měl diplomatický pas.
And it didn't matter at all that I was a senator of the parliament of the Czech Republic at the time. I even had a diplomatic passport. That didn't help either. They treated me like anyone else, just an ordinary traveller. Maybe they simply didn't like me. Maybe I looked at them like some Afghan fighter. I'm dark-haired, dark-eyed, and you know how people look in passport photos. Maybe that played a role too. But in short, I've been to the United States several times and also to Canada, and never has a meeting with an immigration officer been pleasant.
A nikdy to nebylo příjemné setkání s imigračníma úředníkama.
An even more unpleasant experience awaited Senator Mejstřík during a later visit to Los Angeles.
Tam si mě vybrali taky a zase mě otáhli jako bokem. A podotýkám, že předtím jsme prošli rámama. Jako jo.
There, they pulled me aside again, and let me stress, we had already gone through the detection frames. It was clear we didn't have anything we weren't supposed to have. But there they wanted me to undress, which I really didn't want to do. Then they somehow subdued me. They're really very tough. And in the end, you tell yourself, senator or not, it's not worth it. At that moment, you feel that for them, that's no argument at all.
Když mě nakonec sundali i boty, tak já jsem ty boty vzal, chtěl jsem mi dát někam.
Then, when they made me take off my shoes, I took them and wanted to place them on a small shelf about 2 steps away. But at that moment, they immediately charged at me, literally with a taser in hand. If it hadn't been for my assistant, who speaks fluent English and reacted quickly, they might have actually knocked me down with it. It was because I didn't understand that I was supposed to stand on a marked line I wasn't allowed to cross.
Says former independent Senator Martin Mejstřík. So, from John F. Kennedy Airport, I headed east beyond the city limits of New York. I am now on Long Island, and here, in a shopping center called Green Valley, I bought a mountain bike. Why a bike? Well, every time I had come to the US for work before, I always had a car. I would drive to interviews, move from place to place quickly and comfortably, but without really connecting with my surroundings. So this time I decided to do it differently. No car, slower, under my own power. In short, I wanted to experience at least part of America in a different way, to feel it more closely, so to speak. So my plan is to cycle across New York City, then continue on to Philadelphia, through Baltimore and Washington, and finally reach Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Here a short but important side note.
And we're in the Westlake area. This is very close to downtown Los Angeles.
When you hear news reports like here on Fox News, they often cover ICE operations, immigration officers going after undocumented migrants, people without valid papers offering day labor outside stores like Home Depot. You've probably seen or read many reports like that in recent months. But in this Czechast episode, I'm talking about something completely different. Not about crackdowns on undocumented migrants, but about what happens to people who arrive in the United States legally as tourists, students, journalists, or business travelers. And I think it's very important to make it clear that in this episode of Czechast, I'm talking about them. So I cycled through Queens, specifically the Jamaica neighborhood, and eventually made my way to Brooklyn. Here, in a small park, I took a short break and I listened to buskers, street musicians. And that reminds me of something. If you arrive here as a European and want to play music like that in the street or in a park, you need a work visa. Yes, really. Any public musical performance, whether for money or just for fun, is considered work by US authorities. And if you are a foreigner, you need a valid work visa to do it. And watching this performance, I remembered my interview with the Czech legendary rocker Petr Janda of the band Olympic. He once told me how, years ago, he was mercilessly deported from America because he didn't have the right paperwork. So, I'm going to give him a call just to make sure that I remember his story correctly.
Já jsem měl 2 koncerty na Floridě, jeden v Miami a jeden na Key Westu.
I had 2 concerts, both in Florida, one in Miami and one in Key West. I'd been there many times before, always on ESTA, even though there were already signs that other musicians had run into trouble, but I thought I'd get through somehow. But we landed in Miami with my family and they came for me directly on the plane, asked people to stay seated and then ordered Mr. Yanda and his family to disembark. They took us to an office and my wife said, "This is bad, you'll be sent home, you'll see." I thought it wouldn't be so bad, but then they showed me a poster with ticket prices and it was clear. You're not allowed to perform without a special visa, not even for free.
Doprovázel mě do letadla. Takový opravdu vysoký černý Američan. Docela strach, takže jsem...
A really tall black American accompanied me to the plane. He looked intimidating enough that I didn't even think of trying to run. They seated me on the plane, it was almost empty, and I flew back. At home I quickly arranged for a visa and flew back a week later. I had to cancel the concerts, of course, but I asked for a confirmation letter and when I showed it upon arrival, they let me in. But for the next 5 years, every time I flew in, and I've been flying there every year, they would always pull me aside and interrogate me after arrival. Now I have the proper visa, so I can perform legally. But for 5 years I was always separated from the crowd and questioned in an office. Only last year did that finally stop. Whenever they scanned my passport, I saw their expression darken and I knew, please wait here for a moment. And I knew I'd be heading for another interview. But last year, for the first time, nothing.
Rocker Petr Janda doesn't boast about his unpleasant experience from 7 years ago, but he speaks about it openly. No excuses. In his own words, it was simply his own stupidity. Another Czech musician, clarinetist Jaroslav Škuta, had almost the same experience earlier this July. When a Czech expatriate from Utah wrote to tell me about it, I immediately contacted Škuta and asked him for an interview. This was shortly after he had been sent back from the United States. He replied that he wasn't interested in speaking with me. A little later, however, he did share his story with another journalist. I don't want to speculate, but it seems likely that he chose her because he believed she wouldn't look too deeply into the details of his case. And then he succeeded in presenting himself in the Czech media as a victim of harsh and absurd US border controls supposedly introduced under Donald Trump. He didn't respond to my second request for an interview, but here is the official statement from the US Customs and Border Protection published by public broadcaster PBS in Nebraska. According to CBP, after arriving in the United States, Škuta claimed to be entering as a tourist.
During inspection, it was determined he had misrepresented the purpose of his travel and was actually scheduled to perform at multiple events as a professional musician. Performing in the United States constitutes work and requires the appropriate employment-based visa. Škuta did not have the required visa, was refused entry and returned on the next available flight.
In interviews with Czech media, Jaroslav Škuta claimed that performing in the United States as a tourist traveling on ESTA was something of a legal grey area. But that's not true. Janis Sidovský is a music promoter with extensive experience organizing Czech artists' performances in the United States. And he explains.
Každému kolegovi nebo kolegyni, který by jel za účelem veřejného vystoupení do Spojených států, bych poradil.
To any colleague going to the US to perform publicly, I'd recommend arranging a work visa as soon as possible. Without it, you're not allowed to perform publicly. It's like working without authorization. A work visa is absolutely essential. It's an expensive and fairly complex process because everything has to go through an American lawyer whom you must hire yourself. That lawyer then submits the applications to the embassy, and then you're in for an interview in Prague or Bratislava if you're from Slovakia. You need to prove that you're recognized in your field and then basically hope they'll approve your visa. The whole process takes at least 6 months, so you have to start well in advance.
Let me ask directly, what if someone just thinks that he or she will get an ESTA and go ahead with his or her performance without any additional paperwork? After all, who's going to notice?
Ono je taková naivní představa a měl jsem ji i já v 90. letech, když jsem...
It's a rather naive idea, and I admit I had it too. In the 90s, I organized performances for Eva Pilarová and Pavel Vítek at the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center during a Czech-American ball. Back then, we really went without permits, but looking back, I know that was naive. Even if you're performing out of love for your compatriots and not accepting a fee, it's still a public performance, which counts as work, and for that, you need a work permit in the form of a work visa. Thinking you're doing a good deed and will perform for free is unrealistic.
My jsme potřebovali víza jak pro solisty, protože týkalo se to konkrétně vystoupení v Carnegie Hall v sále Zenkel.
The last time we arranged visas for soloists performing at Carnegie Hall in the Zenkel Hall, and we were explicitly told that every performer, including me as manager or even our sound technician, must have a work visa. In total, we needed 14 visas, each costing about 6,000 Czech crowns. And on top of that, you have to pay the lawyer. That cost us around $2,000.
$2,000.
So, just to be clear, am I right in understanding that these rules apply no matter who happens to be in the White House?
Ano, to je platné vždycky a vždycky to tak bylo, akorát ta částka byla trošku nižší, teď se myslím navyšovala minulý rok.
Yes, these rules always apply and have always applied. Only the amounts sometimes change. For example, last year the fee increased by about $50. Otherwise, the rules stay the same and apply to absolutely everyone, even models coming to the US for a fashion show. Anyone performing publicly, whether paid or unpaid, must have a work visa.
Bez ohledu na to, jestli je to zadarmo nebo za honorár.
I cycled through Brooklyn all the way to the iconic bridge connecting it to Manhattan. Here I'm taking a short break, soaking in the unmistakable skyline of Manhattan. It was right here in Brooklyn that Czech writer and journalist Patrik Banga arrived last September. A well-known figure on the Czech literary scene, he had come along with a group of other Czech authors on an official invitation. They were scheduled for public readings, and unlike musical performances, those don't require a work visa. A standard ESTA tourist authorization is enough. Yet even Patrik Banga, and let me stress, this was at a time when Joe Biden was in the White House and Kamala Harris was still seen as a promising Democratic presidential hopeful, had an experience at the US border that he doesn't like to remember.
A najednou přišel úředník, který mě prostě požádal, abych s ním odešel. Já jsem teda v první chvíli vůbec nevěděl, o co jde, ale úředník mě prostě odvedl.
Suddenly an officer came and asked me to come with him. At first I had no idea what was going on, but he took me to a room that looked a bit like a cell. There were about 150 other people there already. They took my phone, told me to sit down, and no one explained what was happening. I thought it was because of the medications I had with me. I take them regularly and I was coming to the US for 2 weeks. I was convinced that was the problem, but all I could do was helplessly watch as they called people out one by one. Some were denied entry, others were let go. I didn't know where my suitcase was. My taxi was waiting outside, as were other people traveling with me. When I tried asking anything, no one spoke to me. I had absolutely no idea what was happening.
Najednou po těch 2 hodinách prostě si mě zavolal úředník, poděkoval mi za to, že jsem se vrátil do Spojených států, popsal mi příjemný pobyt a nic víc.
After about 2 hours, the officer called me, thanked me for coming back to the US, wished me a pleasant stay, and that was it. They gave me a coloured band, I think it was green, maybe orange. Those denied entry got one colour, those let in another. They let me in. Only then did I finally find my suitcase. Pavel Mandis was waiting for me. Everyone else had long since left, and he stood outside for 2 hours, not knowing what had happened to me. That was the worst part. They took my phone and I couldn't communicate with anyone.
Tak se mi nikdo nemohl dovolat, jo.
Despite this unpleasant experience, Patrik Banga hasn't given up on America.
Mně se ve státech líbí, já mám státy rád, ale spíš jako ta nejistota, no. Já vím, jestli to umíš představit, ale když tě zavřou...
I like the United States, I really do. But this, the uncertainty, I don't know if you can imagine it, but when they lock you in a room that looks like a cell and you have no idea why, you watch as people around you are refused entry, sent back, and you're just sitting there waiting to find out what's going to happen to you. You have your hotel booked, the festival organizers are waiting for you, you have a reading scheduled, and you're just sitting there completely in the dark.
A ty vůbec nemáš tušení, o co jde? Vůbec nevíš, co jste dělal.
At last I reached Manhattan. After more than 30 kilometers or about 20 miles in heavy city traffic, I am now walking my bike along Broadway, soaking in the evening bustle as I head towards the Staten Island ferry. Before setting off for the United States, I had looked into some statistics, specifically how often electronic devices like phones are inspected during immigration checks here. And as I record this episode, the most recent data available is from fiscal year 2024, which ended last September. According to them, less than 0.01%, that's 100th of 1% of international arrivals encountered such inspections by CBP officers. So even if, hypothetically, the number of such searches were to increase tenfold in 2025, which seems unlikely given the limited number of officers at border posts, your chances of being asked to unlock your phone or laptop would still be only about 1 in 1,000. Personally, I can say that I was asked to power up my laptop and unlock it during a US border check as far back as 2003. Smartphones didn't exist back then, and I believe they just wanted to verify that my laptop was a real device and not hiding something dangerous inside. But even that could be seen as an intrusion of privacy, and that happened to me 22 years ago. I didn't make a fuss, I cleared the check without a problem, as I have many times since. But back to other Czech US border stories. Another Czech traveler with experience at US borders is photographer Tomky Němec, former official photographer of President Václav Havel. He also ran into difficulties after landing in New York, and this too happened under the previous administration when President Biden was still in office.
Protože jsem nedostal běžnou estu, letěl jsem tam se svým synem.
I wasn't granted the usual ESTA visa waiver. I flew to the US with my son, who got his ESTA within a few hours. For me, it was more complicated. When filling out the questionnaire, which I always complete honestly, even though some questions might seem a bit amusing to us Czechs, the system automatically rejected me. For instance, when asked if I had ever been to Yemen or Iraq, I naturally said yes, because I had. And I know Americans don't appreciate any joking about these matters. The system rejected me because of that, and I wasn't granted ESTA. I had to urgently arrange a standard visa at the embassy, go through an interview with the consul. He granted me a visa for 10 years, which is actually better than ESTA, and he confirmed that the reason I wasn't granted ESTA was indeed Yemen.
Vyhodnotil ten Jemen, že byl důvod toho, že jsem nedostal normální estu.
But even a 10-year visa didn't guarantee that Tomky would get through completely smoothly.
Ve frontě, když jsme přišli na řadu, tak imigrační úředník, který předtím poslal úplně všechny lidi.
When my son and I got to the immigration desk at the airport, I noticed that the officer hadn't let through anyone before me. There were about 7 people ahead of us, and all of them ended up in the same building room as we did later. He simply refused them entry. To be honest, they were all Latin Americans, while we were white Europeans, if I may put it that way. We spent about 2 hours in the detention room, where the atmosphere was very tense. No one spoke to us, no one explained anything. After those 2 hours, they just gestured at me, closed my file, returned my passport, and signaled that I could leave. I was quite confused. When no one tells you anything, you don't want to ask. I know in that situation there's no point trying to start any dialogue unless explicitly addressed.
Češi občas zkoušejí ten svůj humor, ale já bych to nikomu nedoporučoval, protože ty imigrační úředníci prostě jsou ostrý a mají právo veta.
Czechs often try humor in such situations, but I wouldn't recommend that to anyone. Those immigration officers are very strict and have the final say. No one can call them and tell them to let you in. Even if you're granted a visa in Prague and cleared in Frankfurt by another American officer or the airline, the final decision always rests with the immigration officer at the US airport. And in my opinion, that's actually fine. I'm a guest there, and when I'm a guest, I follow the host's rules. I can't complain that those rules exist. I don't have to visit, but if I do, I have to respect that.
Já na tu návštěvu nemusím jít a musím to respektovat.
Even Tonky Němec, though, doesn't complain in the end. He says that he has no problem with US immigration controls.
Protože jsem ve Spojených státech byl asi 10krát a byl jsem tam jak s prezidentem nebo Alem.
I've been to the US about 10 times, whether as part of a delegation with the president or later with Foreign Minister Schwarzenberg, or just on tourist visas. So I have some comparison of how it works in different situations. And I must say, even if you're flying with the president, the immigration officers or the system itself don't care. They're not impressed. They treat you like any other traveler, whether you're a head of state or a regular tourist. And in a way, I respect that, because they measure everyone by the same standard.
Jaksi stejným metrem.
I boarded the ferry that will take me free of charge from Manhattan to Staten Island, where I have my accommodation booked. By the way, this is one of the few things in New York that are truly free, and it even comes with a beautiful view of Statue of Liberty. But back to immigration controls again. It occurred to me that it might be useful to ask someone who has seen things from the other side. First as a student and ordinary traveler, later as someone who settled in the United States and became a naturalized citizen. So I reached out again to my colleague Julie Urbishová, who has been living in New Orleans for many years and whom you may have heard in the previous episode of Czechast.
Já letos nemám v plánu nějak nic dělat jinak, než to dělám vždycky, a to je, že se držím do...
This year I don't plan on changing anything about my approach. I stick to the advice I got over 15 years ago, and that is the immigration officer is the absolute authority. When you approach them, you must follow all the rules. That means don't argue, have all your documents ready in hand. If you are a student, have proof of study, a valid visa, proof of accommodation and similar documents. Simply have everything prepared and answer briefly without unnecessary emotions or explanations. If someone doesn't speak English, like when I invite some of my relatives, for instance my mum, it's common to write them a letter explaining where they are going, to whom and why. We've done that several times and never had any issues.
Nikdy jsme s tím zatím neměli problémy.
And that's it for this episode of Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech, even when the story leads us to US airports and immigration controls. Because, as you've heard, Czech stories turn up even there. Before I go, let me mention that you might also want to check out my sister podcast, Prague Off the Beaten Track, where I recently released a new episode about another beautiful, lesser-known spot in Prague called Dívčí hrady, or the Girls' Castles. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this or other episodes, please follow Czechast, share it with your friends or leave a rating, because it really helps others find us. From New York or from wherever Czech stories lead me, I'm Vít Pohanka. Take care, stay curious, and speak to you soon. Naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.